Góðan daginn öllsumul. Guðmundur Ingi Guðbrandsson heiti ég og framkvæmdastjóri Landverndar. Ég var beðinn að stýra fundi hér í dag og það mér einstök ánægja að gera svo. Nú, að þessum ágæta viðburði standa Evrópustofa, sendiráð Frakklands á Íslandi, Náttúruverndarsamtaka Íslands og Alþjóðamálastofnunar Háskóla Íslands. Ég ætla að leyfa mér að skipta yfir á ensku því að það eru svo margir enskumælandi fyrirlesarar með okkur í dag. So then English, good morning everyone. This will not be repeated in any more languages, I'm sorry about that. My language skill does not extend beyond Icelandic and English. Little bit German and a little bit Russian, although that's getting a bit rusty, so I'm not going to get into that today. But I welcome you all here today to this climate change seminar. The theme of the seminar will be of climate change, of course, but focusing on the impacts upon the oceans and the marine ecosystem, which of course is very important in the Icelandic context. And it's exactly the Icelandic context that we will also be looking in a bit more detail at. So factors such as ocean warming and acidification, the importance of fisheries here in the Icelandic context will be tackled, as well as the upcoming COP21 summit in Paris, or the conference of the parties to the Convention of the Climate Change Treaty. Now, it's my honor to introduce the first speaker, Kelly Rick. She's a founding director of the Varda Group, specializes in managing large international campaigns, including the development of advocacy and communication strategies. Her list of accomplishments is so long that and I'm sorry I'm not going to read it all up, but she has, amongst other things, led the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition for 5 years, the Global Campaign for Climate Action from 2009 to present, and worked on various international forums and fora and projects related to climate change. So it is my great pleasure to invite you here, Kelly. We are really happy to have you here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. This is my first time in Iceland, and I hope I'm coherent since my room was light all night. I didn't sleep as well as I might normally in a darkened room. I just want to say, I'm sure I can see there's many people in the room who are very experienced on some of these issues, and probably on some topics no more than I do. So I'm hoping that I'm going to give you a general overview of these issues to make sure that everyone is on the same page in understanding what we're really talking about here. So first off, just to say that 2014 was the warmest year on record since record keeping began. And the last decade, it was the warmest decade since record keeping began. And the Arctic is warming twice as fast as anywhere on the planet. So I don't need to tell you that Iceland in particular is heating up very quickly. I read an article online in preparing for this presentation and was quite shocked to read that of the 300 or so glaciers that you have here, you're losing something to the effect of 11 billion tons of ice a year. According to this article, that's enough to fill 50 large trucks of ice every minute for a year. And this bridge in this photo, it's the longest bridge in Iceland. I'm sure you probably all recognize it. Well, the river underneath it dried up several years ago, and it now stands on dry ground. And I kept checking these figures because I found them so shocking, but I'm assured that the source of them, Helgi Bjornsson, is quite well known, and he said this is among the highest losses on the earth. So just to quote someone who observed in this article that without glaciers, Iceland is just land. So climate change, and specifically the emissions of CO2, is affecting the ocean in several ways. First of all, sea level is rising. And this is happening for two reasons. One, because as the ocean heats up, water expands. And secondly, as ice sheets melt or collapse or break off, it introduces more water into the sea, which means that you have problems such as coastal erosion and storm surges, such as this one that happened after Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey in 2012. The flooding that happened there wasn't because of the rainfall, it was because of the sea level, coming in and inundating, in particular lower Manhattan, just as this storm surge hit the tiny island nation of Tuvalu just a few months ago after Hurricane Pam. In 2013, I was invited to the Marshall Islands as an expert, and I took this photo of this beautiful coastline, even though it's raising up. It's one of the lowest lying countries in the world. And just a few months later, I saw online that exact same place right after a storm surge. So that's before and that's after. A graveyard nearby is literally crumbling into the sea. You see that concrete block there? That's graves that are just disappearing into the ocean. Secondly, ocean temperatures are getting warmer. That has a lot of impacts. For example, the most famous one probably being coral bleaching. But more than that, warmer waters mean that species may be moving north, which sounds very good for Iceland, but you have to understand that warmer waters also means that the plankton will be affected and they will become more scarce, which will cause a problem for the species up the food chain. And thirdly, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the ocean is acidifying. The ocean has absorbed about 30% of the CO2 that we've emitted since the Industrial Revolution, and the ocean has acidified by about that same amount. Ocean models, some models predict that we will be looking at something like 150% increase in acidification by 2100. That's something like 10 times faster than oceans have acidified in the last 55 million years. And it's having and will have an even bigger impact on all sorts of species, particularly crustaceans, mollusks, and those other species that calcify. And you think that might just be a small number of species, but as you can see from this chart, it's not only the species themselves, but the predators who prey on them, and ultimately the top predators. If you see that little tiny slice up in the top of uninfluenced species, it's about 1%. This slide I've taken from Teresa Ribera from IDRI. I thought it was a fascinating slide which shows really just all of those impacts added up between the introduction of CO2 as well as the impacts of climate change, impacts on ecosystems and on human activities. As you can see, it's huge and it's complicated. And we should really think twice before we start changing that ecosystem even more. You may know that phrase. They say, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's a marketing catchphrase. Well, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. The Arctic, the melting of the sea ice in the Arctic is wreaking havoc on the jet stream. Some models suggest, and some scientists are increasingly arguing that that is partly responsible or largely responsible for the extreme weather that we've been experiencing in North America, in Europe, and in Asia. And we have to also remember that this is a dynamic system. Change doesn't happen in a linear way. Nobody really knows when, at what point, there's going to be a tipping point when the Siberian permafrost melts, or when the Antarctic or Greenland ice sheets become so unstable that they break off or they collapse, adding even more water and climate chaos. So I think, just as a reminder, we really need to think carefully before we rush headlong into increasing exploitation of species or fisheries or whatever else happens as a result of the disappearing sea ice. So what can we do about it? First of all, we need to increase our ambition in terms of mitigating our CO2 emissions. I won't go into details because there will be another speaker talking about the Paris Agreement that is expected to be adopted in December, but I just want to say that the post-2020 commitments to reduce CO2 emissions are inadequate at this stage to keep us below 2 degrees. Now, some of the submissions are on at least within the range of hopefully keeping us on track to stay below 2 degrees C. Others, for example, that have been either announced or anticipated in China, Russia, Japan, and Canada are wholly inadequate and are on the level of keeping us on a pathway to 3 or 4 degrees. I think that we are very likely to achieve a new global agreement in Paris, unlike in Copenhagen 5 years ago, but that's largely because those commitments are not likely to be binding in effect. I think that makes it a lot easier. And I also think that one of the most important things that is under discussion is, there's a negotiating session going on in Bonn this week, and the climate NGOs that are there are pushing very hard on a new global goal to get a complete phase out of fossil fuel emissions by around 2050. And that goal is actually being taken up in some form or another by many governments. At the climate summit in New York last September, Ban Ki-moon noted that quite a number of governments from all sorts of regions and levels of economic development were calling for carbon neutrality by the middle of the century. But the other big issues I think that we need to bear in mind that have to be addressed is, first of all, increasing pre-2020 ambition. We have a very short period of time in which we need to see a peak in global emissions and ultimately a steep decline. So that means doing a lot more on renewable energy and efficiency. And secondly, I think the one thing that's going to be a potential deal breaker for the Paris Agreement is the issue of climate finance and discussions around compensation for loss and damage. I just want to briefly mention what's happening in the United States, because there's a lot, it's been in the media the last couple of days in particular, that the United States can't ratify any treaty because we have a skeptical Congress. And therefore, a lot of the negotiations in Paris are around how we can get something that's legally binding but doesn't require the US Senate to have to ratify a treaty. Obama is doing what he can based on his own executive power. There's a risk, of course, some people are concerned that if there's a new president that comes in who's a Republican, they may undo a lot of that. Some of these things may face court challenges, but just to say that a lot of the renewable energy movement in the US is really unstoppable, not so much because the red states, the conservative Republican states, believe in or care about climate change so much. It actually makes good economic sense. So they've pushed back every effort by the Koch brothers, for example, which has been trying to repeal the renewable energy standards in virtually every state. They've spectacularly failed because, like Texas, for example, just about one of the most conservative states, is actually leading on wind development in the United States. And who would have thought that, we would see a headline like this? This is just from a week or two ago. Saudi Arabia foreseeing fossil fuel phase out this century. So things are seriously changing. Question is whether they will happen fast enough. So I think in terms of climate and ocean, we need a two-pronged approach. First off, we need to phase out greenhouse gas emissions, but secondly, we need to increase ocean resilience. And what specifically can Iceland do? I look at this quote by the International Energy Agency. This is an agency that was set up to support fossil fuel development after the Arab oil shocks in the 70s. They said that no more than 1/3 of proven reserves of fossil fuels can be consumed prior to 2050 if the world is to achieve the 2 degrees C goal. Basically, that means we can't afford to burn the fossil fuel reserves that we already know about. So we really need to stop looking for more. We don't need to go to the Arctic and open up new sources of oil and gas. We've already got more than we can afford to burn. Secondly, I think we could support more marine protected areas to give the ecosystem a bit of a rest and to help build resilience. And finally, just to say that there are a number of issues that are being discussed in general about, for example, maybe at COP21 we should have a big declaration on climate and ocean to raise awareness about the issue. Also, the Principality of Monaco has proposed that the IPCC do a special report on climate and ocean. I think that should be supported. We could really find out a lot more. That will need to be funded. I think it will be voted on at the end of this year. There's a lot of conversation around something called blue carbon, which is about offsetting emissions by protecting ocean vegetation. Well, obviously, I think we should protect ocean vegetation, although I think it's not a question of either or at this point, but and. So I'm going to leave off there and hand over to the other panelists who are going to go into more detail, I think, on some of these topics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I'm going to open up for one or two questions, if that's okay with you. Yeah. So is there anyone who has a burning question for Kelly? I think people they just woke up, I think. No one? All right. We'll also take questions at the end, so no worries. Then next is, oh yeah. Now, you know, I'm going to tell you my name. It's Guðmundur Ingi Guðbrandsson. So you say that after I say yours, okay? So it's Attilio Gambardella. Is that okay? Excellent. I welcome you here to this meeting. Attilio is the is the policy officer for climate action and Earth observation unit in the Directorate General Research and Innovation of the European Commission. He received his PhD in electronic and computer science engineering in 2007 and worked in the research field dealing mainly with Earth observations for the marine environment, hence his connection to the meeting. And in 2009, he started working at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and in 2013, he joined the Directorate General Research and Innovation. And I welcome you to the podium.
Okay, I do not have any slides, so I will just, okay. First of all, let me thank you for inviting the European Union here. There was an internal discussion which DG, Directorate General, should be representing the European Union here. And then it was decided that in this moment, it's important to show, as a research and innovation, it's important to show that we have a lot to give, a lot of interest in the subject that we are discussing today. So what I will try to do in these 15 minutes is to give you an overview of what we have done and what we are planning to do in the coming years through our main instruments to support research and innovation, which are the Research Framework Program. The previous one is called FP7, and the actual one started in 2014 up to 2020 is the Horizon 2020. In particular, I was asked to give a brief overview of what we have been done in terms of ocean acidification. I can proudly say that in the European Union and in our DG RTD, we are at the forefront on this subject. We have been funding the first big, large project, international project on this subject. The name is EPOCA, and one of your main research institutions, the Marine Research Institute of Iceland, was part of it. It started in 2008 up to 2012. It was the first time that it was built a huge knowledge gap was filled in this area. After this, let's say we moved from the basic science, this pure scientific question, to question that also address societal aspects. And to this, okay, we focused on a different area, the Mediterranean, where we addressed the combined effect of several ocean stressors, anthropic impact, warming, waters, and of course ocean acidification, as also looking at how this will impact the social and economical sectors. And today, also this project has finished last year in July 2014, and has provided a lot of information and input, contributing to give to Europe a leading role in this area. Just to give an example, our unit and is also sitting in an important board in the Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center, which is based in Monaco. And now is one of the reference is organization concerning this specific subject. Last project I would like to mention, which is still running, and I think it's particularly of interest for this audience, is a project named Oceans 13. It's still running. It started in 2013, and one of the main objectives is to try to understand the impact of ocean stressors, as I say, the same as I mentioned before, on economic activities, fisheries, aquaculture, and is focusing, is working on three test area, which is the Arctic, Mediterranean, and in the southern hemisphere, the Patagonia. So in order to give a broad overview of how these stressors impact the environment, but also the society that is relying on the services that the environment can provide. And this is a bit what we have planned and funded in the previous research framework program. Today we have two big important actions, initiatives that I would like to briefly introduce. One is it's a set of activities linked to the Transatlantic Research Alliance. This alliance focuses on two main areas, the Atlantic Oceans, and I think we are in the middle of it, and the other one is the Arctic. As concerns the first one of the main thematic area is ocean stressors, and again, acidification and how this impact, how these ocean stressors impact key economic and social aspects of everyday life. These are mentioned. And to support this initiative, already in 2014, and in Horizon 2020, under a specific focus area, I'm sorry to use a bit of jargon, but I will be happy to explain you later to answer to some question. We have the so-called focus area, because we want to focus our efforts, our investments on specific subject. And the blue growth is one of it. Blue growth means not just filling knowledge gap, but also looking for sustainable solution to support the society and the economy. Under this, we have a lot of activities. One that has already started is a big project, Atlantos is the name, that has the main objective of putting together all the observation structures and information and group all the information that are available and develop new source of information to observe and to produce that knowledge base which is needed to then develop new, to fill knowledge gap, and most important, to look for sustainable approaches, sustainable solutions. And then, as I said, another aspect is the Arctic. Arctic, as was previously said, is one of the regions mostly affected by the climate change. And this, of course, is a risk, and also because this change is not simply affecting Arctic, but is affecting everyone, because the effect is slowly, not that slowly, reaching the entire globe. And on the other side, climate change is affecting the Arctic, and this is a clear risk. On the other side, how to tackle this risk, how to, from one side, identify, improve mitigation strategies. On the other side, also to develop adaptation strategy may also be a source of an opportunity that has to drive, in our vision, to sustainable solution, and of course environmentally friendly. For this, in the coming 2 years, 16-17, we have proposed to member states and associate countries, and Iceland is one associate countries of our program Horizon 2020, what we call Arctic package. An Arctic package worth 40 million euros only from our side, and which means also that we are trying also to attract other funds, that can come from national programs and, most important, from international collaboration. This kind of program is mainly addressing other countries in the area of involving Arctic and the north of Atlantic. So US, Canada, and all Arctic countries if possible. And again, it's not just supporting research and the need of filling knowledge gap. One more, we also are interested in developing, in looking for solutions that may drive to a sustainable approach to tackle the change. And I think I'd rather stop here because otherwise I can talk for hours, but this is not the case. And going back to the discussion that is happening today, this week in Bonn, and that will be hopefully finalized in Paris in 2001. Of course, the position of the European Union is pretty clear, and we have also a small poster here reminding us. We have a target that has been agreed and accepted also at the level of member states, is to reduce by 2030 40% of CO2 emission, and to move this target up to 60% by 2050. And this is our base of negotiation. And as you know, discussion is still ongoing this very moment. So I think I'm not in position to give you more insight, also because I'm looking for information and news from my colleagues which are in Bonn. On top of it, in Paris, together with the COP21, the Conference of Parties, there will be other side activities that are mostly more linked to the scientific and technological aspect. And in particular, I'm referring to what's called the Subsidiary Body for Science and Technology Advice, which is a reference body in terms of this discussion. And then the European Union, under the Latvian presidency, has proposed some area of discussion. One of it is on the research dialogue, and the role of ocean in the context of climate change is one of the three main subjects. So just to show how important this subject and these issues are, and how these issues are considered at the level of the European Union, and in particular for what I can say in the research and environment, research and innovation directory from which I belong. And that's it. I think I gave you a lot of information, and I will be happy to reply to your answer.
All right, thank you so much. Are there any questions at this moment? Anyone? People are extremely quiet this morning. Okay, so we'll just leave the questions until the end then. That's no problem, of course. But thank you so much for your insightful information into what is happening at your front. So the next speaker comes from Iceland, is Haukur Þór Hauksson, who is the Deputy Manager of Fisheries Iceland, or the Association Fisheries Iceland, I'm sorry. Haukur holds a business degree from the University of Iceland and the ACI dealing certificate, and is a certified stockbroker with over a decade of experience in banking. So Haukur, where is Haukur? Oh, there you are, sorry. Yeah, I guess I need to put up your slides. I'll find them soon enough. There you go. There we go. Okay. You're welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, I have my dubious background since before I came to the fisheries business. or in derivatives and so forth. Well, I'm just gonna, thanks for having me, just gonna go briefly over the maybe major impacts the climate change may have on the fisheries in Iceland. Just to put a glimpse on how important fisheries is to Iceland, are to Iceland. I think almost all Icelanders know that the impact of fisheries in the Icelandic economy is huge. To put this in perspective, Iceland is the second largest fisheries nation in Europe. So for a tiny country of 330,000 people, this is a big number. The association, Fisheries Iceland, I'm working for, it involves 130 companies distributed all around the coast of Iceland, and they are dealing with fishing, processing, sales and marketing, and innovation. And in this field, as in many others, we have fewer companies nowadays than we used to, and this is because of technology and so forth. It has an impact, fisheries. When we are studying the impact of the Icelandic economy, although I'm not going to dwell on that, we see that the impact is on various sides. I often take the example how linked Icelandic fisheries are to other fields. We saw that, for example, that in texture, just in industrial companies in texture, you would think about sweaters and so forth, but like 50% of all the revenues from Icelandic texture companies is doing nets and fishing gear for Icelandic ships. Just a brief economic impact. Icelandic fisheries holds about 10% part of the GDP, and some studies have pointed out that this figure really is about 20 to 25%. That's because there's a lot of directly linked industries to the fisheries. So just to, and all, as you can see here, the total catch, although it has gone down from 2003, we still are producing more part to the GDP. This picture shows a lot in a way. If we take what we call the largest ships, or the number of trawlers, we see that around 1990, when the quota system starts basically in Iceland, like formally, the number goes from 111 to 49 or 50 nowadays. I think, I will come to that later, I think the system is one of the, in a way, the solutions we can take action on just worldwide, of how we can reduce the problems we are facing and people are talking about here. I think a lot of it has to do with how we are running the system in fisheries. So we are facing, I know there are several economists here that know this story quite well, but we are facing overcapitalization, overfishing, and of the stocks and so forth, and this system was taken in place, and so now we have fewer ships catching the same amount of fish than before. This means also that we are using less oil than we did years ago, and I just did some very simple calculations here, that we are almost getting twice as much amount of volume of fish for the same amount for 1 liter of gasoline than we did. So I think this is at least positive in the topic we are facing here, that it is also an economical factor. I mean, the companies want obviously to use less amount of gasoline. It simply means lower costs. I think the field is getting more aware of the importance of the environmental factors, and just as one example, the association, we granted a 3-year grant for a PhD student who is focusing on ocean acidification in her studies, Hrönn Egilsdóttir, and well, we are looking forward to see what comes out of her studies and the possible impact on the Icelandic zone. Although we know and are aware of that, these studies and the effects from it and what derives from it is quite complicated. Just a few words regarding the fluctuations of stocks and the potential future developments. We are dealing with quite a lot of area that is circulating around the coast of Iceland. There's a lot of ships going in and out and needs surveillance and so forth. And so it's a quite large area we're dealing with here in Iceland regarding Icelandic fisheries. We can, in a way, divide the possible impact on the stock into 2 groups. First is the demersal stocks, or also known as just the white fish, cod and haddock and such. And it seems to be that, at least in the foreseeable future, that change are not maybe likely to change the distribution of these stocks substantially. Most of the catch are caught from September to May, and all kinds of weather, but it is sometimes said that the cod has fear of heights. It means that it doesn't like, in a way, to go into that deep sea. It basically wants to stay, in a way, near the coast. And then we have the pelagic stocks, and we are estimating that the impact into the pelagic stocks is much severe. For example, later this day I will be going to the UK, where we are discussing with the European Union and Norway and Faroe Islands the issues with blue whiting and how each nation is allowed to catch what amount of the stock. And there, for instance, we can see that these nations are doing their research, trying to put forward arguments of why their share should be larger or something like that, and then they focus on spawning areas, feeding areas, where is the juvenile, their areas, trying to put forward arguments of why one country should be able to catch more than the other one, because in the end it's a zero-sum game. If one catches more, it means that another has to be able to catch less. And we see that through the years that pelagic stocks, they fluctuate very much. One year we can catch a lot, the next year we can't, because it's a very diversified and it travels around, and it's very complicated to study the behavior. Although, I just took as an example, for example, what we are discussing tomorrow, the blue whiting. We know the area basically where through the years it's being catched and where it spawns, etc. And we also know how the behavior of the Atlanto-Scandian herring goes broadly. And of course, if the climate change has the effect of the temperature of the sea drastically, then this means that these routes and these areas can of course change. And that means that we would be facing possible totally different figures of what we allowable to catch or what we simply can catch. And then it also awakes the question if increased, for example, we know that regarding the mackerel, that higher temperature usually means that the pelagic stock goes more to the north and to the west. For example, with the mackerel, as I said. But if the increased distribution of warm water is fluctuational rather than continuous trend, then these changes in distribution of fish may reserve themselves in a few years. But if it is a continuous trend, the warming, then the distribution may expand further, and this could quite change the game of the pelagic stocks. So what I am saying is basically that we expect the impact of the pelagic stocks is much more than with the other ones. Yeah, as I say, just to sum it up, the location of the demersal fishing grounds are not believed to show any great changes in the coming years, but pelagic fish stocks fluctuate with numerous factors, but are not believed to show any great unforeseen changes in natural habits, although their pattern might change. Fisheries Iceland promotes sustainable and profitable fishing. That's what we stand for, or like to stand for, based on scientific advice and effective fisheries management. I think it's very important that fisheries management, wherever that is in the world, has to be a system that involves incentives to think ahead and incentives to treat the limited resource in a responsible and sustainable manner. We knew, for example, before the current system we are working on in, the quota system, we had a system where basically worked in a way that the government said, well, okay, you can fish this amount of certain species, then you had the Wild West. Just everybody went out, catch as much as they could in as short time as it could, and this means you are overcapitalized, you are using much more energy, gasoline, so forth, than you need. The fishing gear is used in a not as effective way as it could. So by organizing the system and have these incentives that you do it in a very calculated way, try to do it in as less costly way, use lower gasoline and so forth, and obviously want to treat the stock in a way that you're not overfishing. That's a key issue, I think. I think in brief, these are the main points I have, although we know that these issues are global, and I think what we can do, at least here in Iceland and the association I work for, Fisheries Iceland, we just try to have what we can do and do it correctly and in a good way. But in the end, of course, this is a global issue, and I think if we don't approach it in that manner, then it will be difficult to deal with. And I just want to end up by saying that I think that research is essential in all this. And if we don't have the numbers and figures and research to back our case up, then we are on a weak ground. So I think that more research is something that is essential in the coming years, in the near future. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much for this, Haukur Þór. Any questions for Haukur at the moment? Please, Kelly, go ahead.
Could you go back to the previous slide?
Yeah.
I think
It's the next to the last slide.
Before this,
No,
No,
one.
after.
this one.
Next one. There you go.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
So you're talking there about the location of the fishing grounds.
Yeah.
And where the fish stocks are likely to move. What are you thinking in terms of those points that I mentioned, in terms of the warmer water affecting the plankton and the ocean acidification affecting the creatures that are lower on the food chain, and given that those aren't really limited to inside traditional grounds, inside the EEZ, whatever, they're all over the place. What kind of impact are you expecting on fish stocks? Do you have figures?
Yeah. Well, my simple answer is it's complicated. And I guess that, well, the problem in all this is that it's very hard to calculate exactly, I think, and I'm on weak ground here maybe, I'm not a scientist, but as I understand it, it's hard to say exactly, and that's why I ended up by saying, okay, I think we need much more research to try to calculate these things out. And for example, as I said earlier, what we are discussing with the pelagic stocks with Norway, the EU, and so forth, and there we see that there are being various studies among these countries. They are trying to figure out what's going to happen in the upcoming years. Should we take a step back and be okay with getting a little less here if the stock is going from our shore and so something like this? And from these discussions, we see that there's a lot of just guessing and estimation. There is quite, I have not, it's just my experience, I have not seen a person or a result that basically says, well, if this happens, then this happens. It's just a lot of guessing, and understandably it's a huge area, very complicated. But there are people more adequate to answer this in a better way than I am, so yeah.
I think there is at least one more question for you, so Haukur, I think there is one more question for you, sorry. I think this your question and your answer sort of draws out the complication of ecosystem, and that's especially the food web, or well, it's not only a food web, but Kelly brought up here earlier, was a very good example of how these connections are complicated. I will allow at least one more question for you now, and there was the gentleman over there, please.
Yes, I would like to continue on this slide. You said unforeseen changes in natural habits. You did not mention about the current and change in the melting ice of the North Arctic. The donut hole, so the building of fresh water. What are you going to look into those type of issues?
Yeah, I know that Jón can comment maybe more or less later on, but I think in the broad sense, for example, with the melting ice in the north and south, I mean, some worst case scenario could say, well, okay, this could affect the Gulf Stream, for example. And although I'm saying this, again, I'm not a scientist, I'm nothing nice here maybe, but it also has to do with, we see changes, of course, that if it's fluctuational, the warm changes, or as I said, if this is a continuous trend that we are not quite sure of, then that leads to, like say with mackerel, I've been fishing quite a lot last years. It came to the shore because, well, likely because of the change in the heat of the sea. But what effect it could have, in a way, it could have some positive effect, but it also could have huge negative effect. So the uncertainty in itself is something that we don't want. I mean, because we could end up with a bad side of the coin. Yeah.
Yes, Johan, please go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. Interesting presentation. Not a question, but rather a comment.
Okay, that's fine.
If I may. I'm from the Mar Research Institute in Iceland, and we have been studying this, of course, quite a bit about the effects and the impacts of the climate change on our resources. What is important perhaps and was missing in your presentation was the fact that they predicted 1 to 2 degrees increase in temperature the next 50, 100 years at our latitude is far less than the natural variability in ocean temperature and conditions in the North Atlantic from historical point of view. So I think we can agree that probably the impacts on the demersal stocks are much lesser than the larger stocks. However, we should realize that in the year 2060 we can enter into a cooling period, a cold period. We had ice years in the years 1965 to 1971. Then we had a warm water period 1920 to 1964. We can be now entering into a cold water period that will exceed any impacts of global warming. And it has irritated us a little bit, the scientists in Iceland, and when people have been discussing mackerel and the invasion of mackerel into our waters. Global warming is pointed out as the reason, but we regard even more likely that this is a natural variability, plus competition in the system that is pressing the mackerel westover and northover, just as a likely reason. So we have to keep in mind that we are at this latitude, and in the next decade or so, next few years, we may enter into a cold water period.
Yeah.
All right, I think that could start a very lively discussion. Thank you for your comment, Johan. But our last speaker is the ambassador of France to Iceland, Mr. Philippe Opinn. Mr. Opinn was the head of the Office of the Economic Affairs at the French Embassy in London from 1998 to 2006. Has also worked at the French Ministry of Finance, as well as in New York and in Budapest, but has been serving as the ambassador of France to Iceland since October of 2014. And I believe he will be discussing the COP21 summit in Paris. So I'm hoping that a lot of people from this audience will be able to attend. Mr. Opinn.
Thank you, Gudmundur. I hope I pronounce it well. That's fine. Because as you pronounce my name well, I wanted to reply in the same way. As I'm the last speaker and the only non-specialist, I will try modestly to focus on what I know best, which is the preparation to the COP21 conference, which will be hosted in Paris at the end of the year. In summary, it has been said already, the target of the conference is to get commitments from all members in order to limit the global warming to 2 degrees in comparison to pre-industrial ages. And I would like to focus on 4 points. It will be a big challenge. It's a complex process. We need at least 4 results in Paris, and then we think that Iceland has a role to play. To begin with, we think and we are aware that it will be a difficult task because the target is to limit to 2 degrees. The trend today is between 3 and 4. It is COP21, and the number itself shows that we have had 20 attempts before to get some general agreement on the fight against global warming. And we have seen that since 1997 and the Kyoto Protocol, we have had more disappointments than breakthrough. So we are modest with the task, even though we begin that it is very important and very urgent to reach an agreement there. But that being said, we see at least 4 good reasons to remain optimistic. The first one is that I think there is less and less criticism and doubts about the scientific evidence, in spite of what can be said or read. Then we see that a larger part of the private companies are now aware that it's more expensive to do nothing than to act now. And we have had reports like the Stern report like 10 years ago, which showed that we are not talking about only environment, but about economy and growth, and that our best interest is to act as soon as possible. Then we can act. We have now answers, technical answers, which are at the same time more efficient and less costly than they used to be 20 years ago when we began this process. And also, it has been said by Kelly, we are seeing now that some big actors which were reluctant to act begin to move, like it is the case with China and with the US. It is a challenge that we address in an optimistic way. It is also a process which is very complex. That is my second point. France is taking his responsibility very seriously, and the President Hollande has already begun to travel the world in order to prepare for this big date at the end of the year. At the same time, you must be aware that we are not really president until the conference itself. We are like sharing our responsibilities with the Peruvian presidency, which organized the Lima conference in 2014, at the end of 2014. And we tried to act together with them, and also with the next presidency, with Morocco. And we are only today, with this conference in Bonn, which is beginning, actually chairing the process. And you must be aware also that it is a process which is made of official conferences, official meetings, with a working group called ADP, itself co-chaired by Algeria and the US, which is preparing the text. So between the beginning and the end of the year and the conference in Paris, there will be official meetings co-chaired by these two countries of this ADP working group, supported by the Secretariat of UNFCCC. And at the same time, you will have informal meetings that we try to influence or to organize with between 30 and 40 countries representing the main groups, but open to each one of the countries which would like to be invited. And the way we see our responsibility is to be, of course, neutral. We are part of the EU, it's not a secret, and we share completely the point of view of the EU in concerning environment. But as chair, we will be neutral. We will no longer be European. We will be at the disposal of all groups of countries. We want to be inclusive. That's why we are working closely with former presidency, next presidency, but also with the civil society, and trying to include other countries who want to be included in the process. And also, we believe that everything must be done before. We don't believe in last-minute miracle. We believe that it's not up to a limited number of head of state or head of government to secretly meet at the end of the process and to make a decision in order to engage, to make a decision for everyone. We believe that if we have not progressed enough before Paris, it will be impossible to reach an agreement in Paris. And that's why we try to have a process which is as inclusive as possible. What do we want to reach as a result in Paris? And that is my third point. I think that we need four results. That is what we sometimes call the four pillars of the agreement. We need to have an agreement, obviously, and this agreement needs to be ambitious, limitation to 2 degrees. It needs to be universal but differentiated according to the level of development of each country. That is the global understanding that we have. And we need to have a legally binding agreement that is, I would say, more or less accepted by everyone. And more and more, we accept also the idea that the agreement must be balanced between what we call, in our technocratic words, mitigation, which is limitation of the emissions of greenhouse gases, mitigation on the one hand, but also adaptation, which is the fight against the damages which have already been suffered mainly by poor countries. And also we believe that this agreement must be dynamic. in case we cannot reach this 2 degrees result in Paris, in order to have a kind of inbuilt process allowing each country to add new commitments in the process. The second pillar of the agreement is what we call national contributions. In our technocratic jargon, it is INDC, which means intended nationally determined contributions. It has been agreed that each country, before the COP21, must give its contributions, must express how much and how much it will limit, stabilize or limit its emissions. In order to give you a global idea of who is doing what, as of today, the EU is responsible for around 10% of the global emissions of greenhouse gases. The US, it's less than 15%. China is around 25%. And Russia and India, each one is around 5%, which means that with a relatively limited number of big actors, you can cover around 2/3 of the matter. The idea was to, the target was that those countries able to do so, we had in mind developed countries and big emitters, could make the commitments before the end of March. Swiss has been the first one to do it. Then we have had European Union, which, as was said, has committed to cut by 40% before 2030. We have had Norway, we have had Mexico, we have had US, but also developing countries as Gabon, Russia, Liechtenstein, and so on. So as of today, 38 countries already have published their contributions, and we are expecting 40 more before the end of June. But still, we need to have other contributions in order to see clearly before the COP21 who will do what, and if we can be reasonably confident to reach this target of 2 degrees. Sorry. The third pillar that was already mentioned by some of the speakers is financing. We are collectively committed to raise $100 billion of public and private money coming from developed countries annually from 2020. It seems a huge amount of money, but it must be taken in comparison to the sheer size of the GDP of developed countries. Spain, for instance, it's 1,000 million euros, even more in dollars. France is twice this number. Germany is thrice this number. So it's not that big. And according to the way to make the calculation, we are already slightly above this number, or at half this number, which means that not only we must find this money, but we must also harmonize the way to take into account this financing. A first step was what we call the Green Climate Fund, which is a fund of public money, which was already established. The target was to reach $10 billion before the COP21. We have already reached target, and we are optimistic, and we have good reasons to believe that this fund will be able to work even before we begin this conference in Paris. And the fourth pillar of the agreement is what we call the positive agenda, or the action agenda, or in French, the agenda des solutions. We believe that apart from the commitments from governments, we need to have a series of commitments coming from local governments, from civil society, coming from companies, which are able to act now without waiting for 2020. And so we are trying to collect all these commitments and to add that up before Paris, in order to have not only a general agreement between governments, but also a more general movement which would be able to start immediately. And also the reason why we have in mind this positive agenda is to show that the fight against global warming, it's not only binding agreements. It's not only burden sharing. It's not only negative. It's also opportunities to do something right now, and sometimes with good economic results. And to conclude with a word about Iceland. What could be the role of Iceland? We believe, the next presidency, that Iceland has a role to play. That is why your Minister of Foreign Affairs was in France at the end of 2014. That he is presently in France, meeting with people in charge with this preparation of COP21. That is why the President Grimson was in France in April, meeting my president to discuss about melting of the ice, preparation to COP21, and that is why the President Hollande will be in Iceland in October for the Arctic Circle, in order to deliver a message about Arctic affairs and also about the fight against global warming. Why is Iceland so important to us? It's because we believe that at the same time Iceland is a vulnerable country. That's been said already. It is a country which will at the same time benefit and suffer a lot from the process ongoing. And also we believe that Iceland has all the possibilities to become a low carbon economy, particularly with geothermal. And in all these 4 pillars that I was mentioning, we believe that we can work with Iceland. I was mentioning that we need a universal agreement, and we are working with Iceland in order to benefit from the outreach of Iceland towards mainly emerging countries. We believe that Iceland, its president and its government can convince these countries that global warming, it's not a north-south problem, it's not the north patronizing the south and telling them not to do the same mistake they have themselves done. It is also a scientific problem that Iceland is experiencing immediately right now. As for INDC, we are confident that very soon Iceland will be able to publish its INDC, now that all other European countries have done so. Iceland has already committed itself to this green fund, as was mentioning. And above all, we believe that Iceland has its place in what we call the positive agenda, because of what I was telling. Because through geothermal, we believe that Iceland has developed an answer to this problem, and a kind of renewable energy which can be interesting and transferred to emerging and developing countries. Thank you to all. Merci, Madame la Présidente, d'être ici. I told you when I began that it's a big challenge, and you will understand that we need your help, and we all need to be very optimistic about this task before the end of the year. Thank you to all.